New York City sending 4,500 migrants back to Texas, offering free one-way plane and bus tickets to other states. So Abbott sends migrants to New York, then New York spends all this money, millions, to send them back to Texas. The Big Apple has spent more than...
So Texas has sent around 30,000 people to New York on buses, and it looks like New York is now trying to send them back. In fact, asylum seekers here can not only get a free plane or bus ticket anywhere in the world, after their shelter stays expire, they're forced to reapply for housing at a location where these are handed out, revealing that even though New York is America's largest sanctuary city, our leaders don't want people staying here for some reason.
Governor Greg Abbott might have thought that he had the last laugh when he bussed tens of thousands of migrants from his state to New York City. But the Big Apple's mayor, Eric Adams, might have one-upped him. Adams is sending 4,500 arrivals back to the Lone Star State.
Adams is also returning migrants to Illinois, Florida, and Colorado. Abbott's office blasted Adams' move, saying, quote, "Hypocritical Mayor Adams said busing migrants is morally bankrupt."
I voted for Trump because of the economy.
Much like the trend nationally, many New York voters this year were driven by the economy and immigration, especially after Texas Governor Greg Abbott started busing migrants here 2 years ago.
Throughout his campaign, President-elect Donald Trump promised sweeping changes to what he painted as an out-of-control immigration system. And now, with his presidency secured, immigration advocates in New York City say they're bracing for what's to come.
Suddenly, it's not a sanctuary city all of a sudden, as they want to send the people back to Texas.
So, as New York continues to tout its sanctuary city status, it's secretly doing everything possible to help people leave. But what nobody's talking about is that this is just the latest example of how the asylum crisis has failed to bring about any meaningful improvements in the lives of asylum seekers. Because although over 200,000 have come to New York after our city offered them the American dream and a place to stay, the place to stay kicks them out after 1 or 2 months before most asylum seekers have had time to get jobs or plug into the local economy. Something we were all told wasn't going to happen here, as our leaders bragged about how our city had thousands of jobs just waiting to be filled by people getting off buses right here at the bus terminal. But if you visit any of the city's 200 asylum shelters, you'll see that asylum seekers are facing just as much poverty and joblessness here in America as they were in their home countries. And honestly, it's really sad to see thousands of able-bodied people who were lied to with no way to better their lives by working and living independently. And whether or not you are for or against the asylum crisis, it should be pretty obvious that in order to get so many people to travel to a place which has no opportunity for them, you've got to tell them something that's not true. And observers say that's what's happened in New York, as thousands of people were allowed to move into our shelter system believing in a future that doesn't exist, only to be moved out of it a few months after they get here because the shelter system is full, and new people who believe there's a future here for them also need to stay there for 1 or 2 months as well. Which brings us to the real reason why New York has this bus program. Once people figure out that this is not some magical land of opportunity, they're faced with the reality that staying here isn't gonna help them. Something our leaders have known would happen all along, yet because of New York's proud progressive values, admitting our policies just waste money while failing to help people isn't on the table. And as you're about to see, while New York is quietly helping people leave, it's also doubling down on sanctuary city policies it already has proof aren't working. As a knee-jerk reaction to President Trump's re-election, which most people here thought wasn't gonna happen. So here we are at the Port Authority bus terminal, where around 4,500 asylum seekers have gotten tickets back to Texas, some on the very buses they arrived on. And the irony here is that New York, the sanctuary city, is proving that it's not able to help people, even though that's what it claims its purpose is. But what it can do is set people up for failure while still being able to claim, hey, we're progressive, we still have a right to shelter, we're still a sanctuary city, we're still able to help you. Which might help the non-asylum seekers that run this place feel good about themselves, but basically makes New York a sanctuary city in name only.
New York City sending 4,500 migrants back to Texas, offering free one-way plane and bus tickets to other states. So Abbott sends migrants to New York, then New York spends all this money, millions, to send them back to Texas. The Big Apple has spent more than
So it's important to understand the overarching principle behind both of these bus programs. Everybody that got on a bus from Texas to come to New York did so willingly, but they probably wouldn't have done so willingly had they known that things would turn out different and that they'd just be getting on another bus to go back to Texas willingly after a couple of months. And people are just trying to go to a place where they think they're going to have the best opportunity for themselves and their families. That's why they came to New York in the first place, and now that's why they're leaving New York in the second place. But that's not supposed to be how any of this worked out, because we've had over 200,000 people come to New York, which had its sanctuary city doors wide open and looked like it was going to be a place where people could start chasing after the American dream, which they were allowed to believe was going to happen when they got off buses and moved into our shelter system. But underneath the veneer of care that this city was putting forth was a big lie about opportunities that awaited people here, like jobs and a better future that just haven't existed ever. And now people have to leave and try to go find it somewhere else. And they're doing it with the city's help. But look at this, asylum seekers weren't the only ones who believed there was something good here waiting for them. As of October, there still should be 18,000 jobs out there for people who might live in shelters at the moment. But if those jobs are really out there and available to asylum seekers, it would be great for those companies or those businesses to start hiring, because we've got people living in tents outside of the shelters they've been evicted from because they've got nowhere else to go. And certainly a job from one of the 400 employers identified by the local government here would really help them pay rent and get off the streets. And certainly a job that someone could work at and provide for themselves would negate the ticket program New York City has to help people get on buses and leave town. Unless, of course, the job market here isn't as rosy as people are being told it is, and these jobs either aren't available or the positions have already been filled. And if the job market were as great for asylum seekers as we're being told, we probably wouldn't see the effects of mass unemployment at every single shelter in town, which proves that there is an opportunity here for them, and they were told that there was.
And it goes back to politics again. Now New York has seen that they can't handle the situation, because not only just the amount of people, but also economically as well. So I can tell you for a fact that in Texas, we're going to continue busing them to these sanctuary cities, because again, these are sanctuary cities. They did welcome immigrants from day one. So
all of this opportunity that people were led to believe was here turned out to be a big lie. And this is evident in the city's own reporting. Remember, over 200,000 asylum seekers have come here. We've got tens of thousands of jobs available, but only 2,000 people, according to this article, have actually been connected with employment. And although some asylum seekers have to wait a month and others have to wait 6 months to get work authorization, this crisis is 2 years old at this point, and only 2,000 people have been connected with jobs. That's not a system that's working out in anybody's favor. And if someone moves into one of our asylum shelters and they can only stay for 1 or 2 months, but they aren't able to get a job and unable to start providing for themselves, and then they have to move out, what other option do they have other than to live in a tent outside of that shelter, as some people are doing, or to get on a bus and try to make it somewhere else? Well, obviously most people are leaving, and it looks like 47,000 one-way tickets have been purchased in total since this program started. And 40,000 one-way tickets means that 22% of the 212,000 asylum seekers who've come here have been paid to leave in some capacity. And what that means is the asylum programs we have to care for people in New York aren't as helpful as we may have thought.
Political strategists say, much like the trend nationally, many New York voters this year were driven by the economy and immigration, especially after Texas Governor Greg Abbott started busing migrants here 2 years ago.
If you have Democrats in charge of the state, Democrats in charge of the city, Democrats in charge of the country, if you're not happy, you kind of go to the Republican.
Now, as you're about to see, our progressive leaders, they're not paying attention to how ineffective these policies are, and they're actually about to double down on them, in spite of the fact that they aren't working, and in spite of the fact that voters, in greater numbers than ever before, are voicing their opposition to them. And even though many people are starting to figure out that the asylum crisis isn't helping anybody, our leaders aren't of that mindset. Because here in New York, you've got an electorate that does not like Donald Trump. Remember, he lost this state, and what that means is the politicians that we have here, it's going to be their mandate to resist whatever his plans are for New York City and for immigration as a whole for this country. And although this might not be true of every district in New York State, some of which recently voted red for the first time, in New York City itself, especially places like Brooklyn that voted 80% in favor of Vice President Harris, the mandate still holds. But as you're about to see, when progressive policies aren't working, admitting that they don't work isn't part of the equation. Instead, the reason they failed is because they weren't progressive enough, or we didn't have enough of them, or we ran out of money. Which is why New York City is about to do more of the things that aren't helping asylum seekers at all, but are in fact making their lives even tougher. So the longer the asylum crisis continues, the more apparent it becomes that progressive sanctuary cities do absolutely nothing to help those who want to become law-abiding permanent residents. Yet after the election, New York City's leaders have already announced their plans to fight tooth and nail against every immigration policy President Trump tries to enact once he takes office, which means New York is going to become even more of a sanctuary city than it is right now.
President-elect Donald Trump promised sweeping changes to what he painted as an out-of-control immigration system. And now, with his presidency secured, immigration advocates in New York City say they're bracing for what's to come.
We're going to fight it. We're as prepared, if not more prepared than the first time around. We fought him not just in the streets.
I'm sorry, I don't want to single out this one particular person, but what is this idea? What are people fighting against? What does New York City think it can do to control U.S. immigration policy? If anything, the asylum crisis proves that New York has no control over federal immigration policy. Because for the last 2 years, the asylum crisis has absolutely exploded here. And it's not benefiting the lives of people who fled poverty thinking they'd come here and experience heaven on earth. That has not happened at all. But what has happened is the prolonging of poverty, the prolonging of suffering and joblessness. And this all happened before Trump was even president and didn't look like he had a chance to ever get back in the White House. And if anything, the last 2 years have been a great opportunity for sanctuary cities in this country to prove how great they are and how much they can help people, but they haven't proved that. But they have proved they can harbor dangerous gang members and wanted fugitives from federal immigration authorities who are trying to keep people safe. We'll get to that too, but people shouldn't need free tickets to get on a bus like this if there's something here that benefits them. With this crisis not directly benefiting the very people it's named after, you've got to wonder who's actually in favor of this. Obviously, it's politicians that now see themselves as the resistance to a president that hasn't even taken office yet. It benefits the bus companies, who now get to make more money transporting some of the very same people back to Texas, where they got paid to bring them here. And sadly, it also benefits people who aren't allowed to legally reside in the country and are on some sort of federal wanted list. And those people are not the asylum seekers. Asylum seekers, they can reside anywhere in the country they want because they're here while they wait for a court date in the future. If you don't have an asylum court date, or if you have been ordered to leave the country, you've only got one choice, and that's to come to a sanctuary city. And who does that? Well, we know the gang members are doing it. They've been caught living in some of our shelters right here in New York, using them as a base to commit crime all over our city. Yet because we're a sanctuary city, there's nothing that can be done to remove the criminal element from places that are supposed to help people. And this small number of people is doing great damage to our city, and they're causing great harm to asylum seekers who they are here to exploit. And sanctuary city status allows these folks to hide here while living relatively normal lives compared to being fugitives in other parts of the country. Here, your immigration status doesn't matter. And the scary thing about this gang is the way that they operate is through human exploitation. And how is allowing them to live in shelters where you have families and little kids who are trying to start a new life a good idea for anybody? It's not. Yet by promising to resist and fight against Trump by putting forth policies that ultimately only benefit criminals, our leaders aren't creating a safe space for immigrants in any way, but they are creating a safe space for some very unsafe people.
Trump has promised mass deportations using the National Guard to round up immigrants and bringing back policies he put in place during his first term. Mayor Eric Adams has repeatedly pressed the current administration for federal assistance as the city's resources struggled to keep up with the wave of asylum seekers arriving in the city.
So this whole asylum crisis, it's a manufactured mess. And what does the city do? Well, they allow the mess to continue, and then they beg the federal government for money to solve it. Now, Mayor Adams is bound by the law. He has to carry out right to shelter whether he likes it or not. And to do it, he's gonna need massive amounts of money. And the hope when this whole crisis started is that that money would come from the federal government, but it never did. But even though New York didn't receive the massive amounts of money needed to house the entire world, which is what's gonna happen when you have sanctuary city status and a right to shelter, they still had to go through with it, which did keep people, especially families with little kids, from having to live on the streets. Yes, right to shelter did accomplish that, and nobody wants to see families on the streets. But because we're not a law and order state, and because we're a sanctuary city, having families live in a shelter system that is also populated with gang members who are trying to recruit new members and find people who they can exploit, that's not a good situation either. And that's the situation we're now dealing with, and that we're now saying we're going to do everything in our power here in New York to maintain. And what's crazy is that New York City's shelters wouldn't be like this if we were not a sanctuary city. If we had a right to shelter and we still housed asylum seekers, the situation in those shelters would look very different if police were actually allowed inside, but they're not allowed in. Police can't patrol these places, but the gang members who live in them can, and they are. And these gangs are fueled by two things, which the asylum crisis here in its current state gives them: lawlessness and poverty. They've been exploiting the poor in their own countries, which is why those folks fled. And now those folks have to flee again, many of them on the very same buses that brought them here. This system is not working, yet it's going to continue in the future as a symbol of resistance and as a symbol of New York City's progressive values. Is that what's going on here? Is that why this system that's not helping anybody is going to continue? Or is there another reason? Do you think that this is part of the resistance against an incoming president who says he wants to make sweeping changes to U.S. immigration law? Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. I'll see you in the next video.